Letter 16 is going to be about exploring different churches. Letter 16. My dear Wormwood, you mentioned casually in your last letter that the patient continued to attend one church, and one only since he was converted, and that he is not wholly pleased with it. May I ask what you are about? Why have I no report on the causes of his fidelity, meaning faithfulness, to the parish church? A parish church is just the local church. So why have I no report on the causes of his faithfulness to the local church? Do you realize that unless it is due to indifference, it is a very bad thing? Surely you know that if a man can't be cured of church-going, the next best thing is to send him all over the neighborhood looking for the church that suits him until he becomes a taster or connoisseur of churches. And you hear this idea a lot, of this idea of church hopping, right? The person that's like, oh, I need to try out several different churches until I make my decision on which one I want to be my home church. But how often does that person never make a decision? And they just keep going to different churches and different churches and different churches, but they never find the quote unquote perfect church. And that's because no perfect church exists, right? But here the devils say, like, we want them doing that, right? We want them to constantly be church hopping and never find a local church, because then they never get plugged in. The reasons are obvious. In the first place, the parochial organization, in other words, the organization that's like in charge of the church, should always be attacked, because being a unity of place and not of likings, it brings people of different classes and psychology together in the kind of unity the enemy desires. The congregational principle, on the other hand, makes each church into a kind of club, and finally, if all goes well, into a coterie, a group, or faction. In the second place, the search for a suitable church makes the man a critic, where the enemy wants him to be a pupil. What he wants of the layman in church is an attitude which may indeed be critical in the sense of rejecting what is false or unhelpful, but which is wholly uncritical in the sense that it does not appraise, does not waste time in thinking about what it rejects, but lays itself open in uncommenting, humble receptivity to any nourishment that is going. You see how groveling, how unspiritual, how irredeemably vulgar he is. This attitude, especially during sermons, creates the condition most hostile to our whole policy, in which platitudes can become really audible to the human soul. There is hardly any sermon or any book which may not be dangerous to us if it is received in this temper. So pray bestir yourself and send this fool round the neighboring churches as soon as possible. Your record up to date has not given us much satisfaction. The two churches nearest to him I've looked up in the office. Both have a certain claims. At the first of these, the vicar is just the local pastor. So at the first of these, the pastor is a man who has been so long engaged in watering down the faith to make it easier for a supposedly incredulous and hard-headed congregation that it is now he who shocks his parishioners with his unbelief, not vice versa. So in the first, there's two churches close to the patient. In the first, you have a pastor who waters down his sermon. And I think we all know a church or two like this in the area where you live, to where he's not preaching the truth, the pastor isn't. And instead, he's preaching a broader truth, perhaps, and he's watering down what the scripture actually says. And so in the patient's life, that's what one of these pastors does at his church. And it's not healthy for the church to have a pastor who does that. He has undermined many a soul's Christianity. His conduct of the services is also admirable. In order to spare the laity of all difficulties, he has deserted both the lectionary and the appointed psalms, and now, without noticing it, revolves endlessly round the little treadmill of his 15 favorite psalms and 20 favorite lessons. And so this pastor, he also doesn't want to really challenge his church or make them really think or get, confused about scripture. And so he uses the same 15 or 20 verses over and over and over again, instead of pouring into his congregation and forcing them to grow as Christians. We are thus safe from the danger that any truth not already familiar to him and to his flock should ever reach them through Scripture. But perhaps your patient is not quite silly enough for this church, or not yet. Okay, and the second paragraph goes into the second church that is near the patient. At the other church, we have Friar Spike. That's the pastor of the other church. The humans are often puzzled to understand the range of his opinions. Why he is one day almost a communist and the next not far from some kind of theocratic fascism. One day scholastic and the next prepared to deny human reason altogether. One day immersed in politics and the day after declaring that all states of this world are equally under judgment. We, of course, see the connecting link, which is hatred. The man cannot bring himself to preach anything which is not calculated to shock, grieve, puzzle, or humiliate his parents and their friends. And the second pastor, basically, his lessons revolve around hate and the idea of like shocking and putting fear into people, which again, that's kind of the opposite approach of the church number one that the patient has near him. And that's also not the best approach either, right? And so which one are you supposed to go to? And these are the type of churches that the devils want you to go to. They want you to either go to one that's like all fire and brimstone to where you're sitting there like, what the heck is happening? Or go to a really watered down one that maybe it's entertaining or maybe it makes you feel comfortable, but are you growing and stretching and learning as a Christian? A sermon which such people could accept would be to him as insipid as a poem which they could scan. There is also a promising streak of dishonesty in him. We are teaching him to say, the teaching of the church is, when really he means, I'm almost sure I read recently in Martian or someone of that sort, which is like a philosopher. But I must warn you that he has one fatal defect. He really believes, and this may yet mar all. But there is one good point which both these churches have in common. They are both party churches. Party churches are basically churches that are built around like certain practices or faiths. I think I warned you before that if your patient can't be kept out of the church, he ought to at least be violently attached to some party within it. I don't mean on really doctrinal issues. About those, the most lukewarm he is, the better. And it isn't the doctrines on which we chiefly depend for producing malice. The real fun is working up hatred between those who say Mass and those who say Holy Communion, when neither party could possibly state the difference between, say, Hooker's doctrine and Thomas Aquinas, both theologians, in any form which would hold water for 5 minutes. And all the purely indifferent things, candles and clothes and whatnot, are an admirable ground for our activities. He says, so another great church to get him involved in is one that's focused on the unimportant things, that's gotten hung up in these little ideas of, how many candles should be out, or what direction and how many seats should we have in our sanctuary, and how many across each row, and how many rows back should the seats be, how many exact worship songs should be sung every week that's like the perfect number, right? These things don't matter. Right. Those are like the little things that each church might deal with, but you don't want to get hung up on those things because ultimately they do not matter. And Screwtape here says that's the kind of church you want him to go to, the kind that gets really hung up on the little things. We have quite removed from men's minds what that pestilent fellow Paul used to teach about food and other unessentials, namely that the humans without scruples should always give in to the humans with scruples. In 1 Corinthians, Paul talks about how back in the day, right, they used to worship idols, and people would bring food to the temples for the gods or the idols, right, as offerings. And either people would then eventually go to the temples and eat the offerings, or they would sell the leftovers to the market. And so in 1 Corinthians 8, Paul talks about, okay, is it okay to eat that food if you don't believe in the idols, right? If you just like need to go to the market and buy food or whatnot, is it okay to do that? Well, even some Christians, early Christians back in the day, they still had fear of those idols. And in 1 Corinthians 8, Paul addresses that. So I just want to read to you 1 Corinthians 8, 10 through 13. For if anyone sees you who have knowledge eating in an idol's temple, he will not be encouraged if his conscience is weak to eat food offered to idols. And so by your knowledge, this weak person is destroyed, the brother for whom Christ died. Thus, sinning against your brothers and wounding their conscience when it is weak, you sin against Christ. Therefore, if food makes my brother stumble, I will never eat meat, lest I make my brother stumble. Right, so it's this idea of knowledge versus love, and what are you willing to do for your fellow Christian in order to cause him not to stumble. You would think that they would not fail to see the application. You would expect to find the low churchman genuflecting and crossing himself, lest the weak conscience of his high brother should be moved to irreverence, and the high one refraining from those exercises, lest he should betray his low brother into idolatry. And so it would have been, but for our ceaseless labor. Without that variety of usage within the Church of England might have become a positive hotbed of charity and humility. Your affectionate uncle, Screwtape. And so this letter 16, just goes through the different types of churches that are out there, and really the ones that you want to steer away from. Right? He talks about the ones that the devils really want you to be active in, and essentially they're the ones that aren't focused on the right thing. Right? They're not focused on the Christians within them helping each other grow in their faith, and they're focused on the menial, insignificant things instead.